In the burgeoning year of 1120, the reign of King Henry I of England, youngest son of William the Conqueror, truly stood at its gilded zenith. Decades of cunning diplomacy and brutal warfare had allowed him to conquer Normandy, effectively reuniting the English and Norman crowns and consolidating his power with an iron fist. Yet, amidst all his conquests and political triumphs, Henry possessed a jewel far more precious than any territory, any captured castle, or any strategic alliance. William Adelin, his sole legitimate son, his perfect, indispensable heir. For days, an unspoken dread hung heavy over the royal court. A suffocating silence where whispers died on lips and eyes avoided the king's chambers. The meticulous planning of a lifetime, the brutal suppression of rivals, all now rendered meaningless. Henry, once the epitome of cunning stability, was now desperate, almost consumed by a frantic, obsessive quest for a new male heir. He swiftly married a much younger woman, Anarchy of Louvain, a union driven not by affection or desire, but by a desperate public gamble, a final, fervent hope for a new son to secure his legacy. Yet, year after agonizing year, Anarchy remained barren. No male heir was born. The pressure mounted, not just from within his own court, but from ambitious rival claimants in Normandy and Anjou, circling like vultures. The kingdom, once so stable under Henry's iron grip, began to hum with a palpable undercurrent of anxiety, a widespread fear of brutal civil war once. The king drew his last breath, faced with this grim and increasingly undeniable reality. Henry was forced to make an unprecedented and deeply unpopular decision. He would name his formidable daughter, Matilda, the widowed empress, as his successor. This was a radical, almost unthinkable departure from centuries of tradition. No woman had ever ruled England in her own right. To the proud, war-hardened English and Norman barons, the very thought of swearing fealty to a female ruler was anathema, a violation of the natural order. 3 separate times, Henry, through sheer force of will and intimidation, compelled his unwilling vassals to swear solemn oaths of loyalty to Matilda, each oath extracting a deeper, more resentful, and ultimately hollow commitment. Yet, even as they swore their fealty with bowed heads, whispers of dissent, defiant murmurs, and outright plots echoed through the great halls of power. The heavy crown of England, once passed seamlessly from father to son, was now caught in a precarious, unstable balance. A fragile hope resting on the shoulders of a woman few truly accepted, and many actively scorned. Henry's desperation grew, feeding a ruthless, blinding paranoia. Every loyal subject was scrutinized, every potential rival ruthlessly suppressed, often with extreme prejudice. He was a king haunted, not just by the overwhelming grief of losing his beloved son, but by the relentless, gnawing anxiety that his entire legacy, his hard-won dynasty, would crumble into dust, consumed by chaos the very moment his eyes closed forever. The kingdom itself seemed to hold its breath, teetering on the brink, waiting for the inevitable storm of the Anarchy to break, a storm set in motion by the loss of the White Ship and the king's own desperate, unfulfilled hunger. No one dared tell King Henry the full, devastating truth. The man who finally gathered the courage, a young page, collapsed at Henry's feet. Weeping uncontrollably, unable to speak the words that would shatter a king. When Henry finally understood, when the crushing reality that his perfect, golden son, William Adelin, was irrevocably gone, drowned in the frigid waters of the Channel, the man famed for his iron will, his calculating intellect, and his unwavering composure simply collapsed. Chroniclers tell us with chilling consistency that King Henry I, the mighty lion of justice, never smiled again. The vibrant, calculating monarch who once projected an image of invincible, unyielding power was utterly shattered. He was reduced to a hollow shell, physically consumed by a grief so profound, so all-encompassing, it seemed to physically wither him. The gilded zenith of his reign had not merely passed, it had been violently ripped away, leaving behind a gaping, unfillable void at the heart of his kingdom and his very soul. For Henry, the heavy crown that once symbolized triumph and undeniable authority was now a constant, brutal reminder of everything he had lost, every hope that had perished. Every waking moment was haunted by the ghost of his only legitimate son, a phantom heir whose sudden, brutal absence now threatened to unravel everything he had tirelessly, ruthlessly built, the stability, the succession, the very future of his Norman dynasty. The shadow of the white ship had fallen, not just over the waves, but directly onto the king's throne. This young prince, barely in his late teens, was the embodiment of Henry's every hope, the living guarantee of a dynasty's stability and continuity. He was the youthful, robust scion who would one day inherit the very crown of England, ensuring a future for a kingdom only recently settled after generations of chaos and Norman conquest. It was a dazzling, unbroken line, assured by royal blood, strategic marriages, and unquestionable might. A prospect so perfectly secure, so divinely ordained, it seemed almost too good to be true, destined to last for 1,000 years. Yet, as history so often proves, fate harbors designs far more treacherous than any king's ambitions. On that truly fateful night, the legendary white ship prepared to depart Barfleur, Normandy, bound for England. Aboard her was not just William Adelin, but an entire generation of England and Normandy's aristocratic elite, Henry's closest advisors, his other children, and the heirs of countless noble houses. In a night of excessive celebration, fueled by too much wine and driven by reckless decisions to outpace other ships, the vessel set sail into the oppressive, unforgiving darkness. Barely out of the harbor, a horrifying, grinding crunch tore through the night. The white ship had struck a submerged rock. Within moments, the hopes of an entire kingdom, the meticulously planned future of a dynasty, transformed into a terrifying vortex of splintered steel, waterlogged wood, and desperate, drowning souls. Hundreds perished in the freezing, unforgiving waters, pulled down into the depths. But their collective deaths were more than an unparalleled maritime tragedy. They were the genesis of an unprecedented political nightmare, a seismic shock that would unravel Henry's meticulously crafted stability, and a chilling curse that would forever haunt the very core of King Henry's being. How could such an unimaginable disaster, such an irreplaceable loss, possibly lead to the chilling whisper of a king who, consumed by grief and desperation, literally devoured his own son? The answer, both horrifying and symbolic, lies deeper still, in the abyss of despair, the insatiable hunger for power, and the darkest corners of human desperation. The devastating news of the White Ship disaster reached England not in a swift, brutal blow, but slowly, piece by agonizing piece. With William Adelin, the anchor of his dynasty, tragically gone, the Norman line faced its gravest existential crisis. The terrifying specter of a succession catastrophe. As if the profound, soul-shattering trauma of the White Ship were not enough, another, far more insidious and creeping horror began to grip Henry's already fractured kingdom. The relentless scourge of famine and mounting despair that the truly ghastly whispers began to circulate, rumors that would forever stain the legacy of King Henry I, twisting his historical image into something monstrous. He became utterly consumed by an obsession so potent, so pathological, that it twisted the very core of his formidable being. The irreparable loss of William Adelin wasn't merely a devastating dynastic blow, a political inconvenience. It was a psychological wound that festered with every passing moment, transforming the once respected lion of justice into a monarch perpetually haunted by a phantom limb. The excruciating throbbing ache of the missing heir. His court once a bustling, vibrant center of political maneuvering and strategic alliances now became a place permeated by an unspoken dread. A suffocating silence where courtiers moved like hesitant shadows, always acutely aware of the king's deepening, unpredictable mood and his terrifying, unpredictable outbursts. Henry's focus narrowed with terrifying, almost laser-like intensity, fixed solely on one concept: the stability of his throne, which he saw as intrinsically linked to the presence of a male heir. Every subsequent political maneuver, every harsh decree, every seemingly strategic alliance was now driven by a singular, desperate, almost feverish need to somehow replace William, to reclaim the future that had been so brutally, so unjustly stolen from him in the icy depths. He viewed his daughter Matilda's succession not as a proud, enduring legacy, but as a reluctant, deeply resented compromise, a constant, nagging reminder of William's irretrievable absence, his efforts to secure a place, and thereby his dynasty's future, were relentless, bordering on tyrannical, as if by sheer, unyielding force of will. He could magically conjure back the stability and certainty that William had personified. His ruthlessness, already legendary, grew exponentially, feeding on his raw grief and gnawing anxiety. Any hint of dissent, any whisper of a rival claim, any perceived slight, was now crushed with unprecedented, chilling severity, often leading to brutal executions or mutilations. The heavy, gold-laden crown, once worn with supreme authority and pride, now seemed to press down on him with immense, suffocating weight, an unbearable burden that bore the invisible, yet indelible, imprint of his lost son's boundless potential. He was a man literally devoured by his grief, a king consumed by a void no power could fill, and his kingdom, by extension, began to feel the chilling, tightening grip of his personal torment and relentless pursuit. The critical question was no longer if he could somehow regain what was lost, but how this insatiable, all-consuming hunger for a vanished future would finally, horrifyingly, manifest itself not just in his actions, but in the dark collective consciousness of his people. The precise origins of these terrifying tales remain shrouded in the impenetrable fog of history, but many contemporary accounts and later interpretations point directly to the brutal, prolonged sieges undertaken by Henry's forces, particularly those campaigns that stretched for agonizing months, utterly depleting all resources within the besieged strongholds. Imagine the scene within such a besieged castle, walls battered and crumbling under constant assault. Food supplies dwindling to nothing but dust and desperation. The desperate cries of hungry children echoing like ghosts in the ruined halls. Soldiers, once proud and strong, were reduced to skeletal, desperate figures, driven to unimaginable lengths for mere survival, their humanity eroding with each passing day of starvation. It was in precisely such desperate circumstances that chroniclers, with veiled language and uneasy euphemisms, began to allude to the unthinkable. Accounts from the era speak vaguely of the greatest cruelties inflicted by hunger, of men resorting to eating anything they could find to survive. While no definitive historical text explicitly states, King Henry I himself literally consumed his son, William Adelin's body, after all, lay entombed at the bottom of the Channel, or even that he directly ordered human flesh to be consumed. The enduring, stomach-churning legend takes root precisely here. The terrifying rumor, fueled by a populace pushed to madness by starvation and fear, suggested that Henry, in a moment of ultimate, chilling desperation or a horrifying display of cold, unfeeling defiance during a siege, implicitly allowed, or perhaps even actively participated in, the ultimate taboo, cannibalism. This wasn't necessarily the physical consumption of William Adelin's body, but a symbolic act so profound, so utterly horrific, that it became twisted in the minds of a desperate populace into a visceral, literal narrative. Some modern scholars now suggest that this ghastly story emerged from a place of deep psychological horror, the idea that a king, consumed by the irreplaceable loss of his beloved heir, and by the relentless, gnawing hunger for a stable, unbroken succession, metaphorically devoured his own future, his own hope, his own soul, and in the minds of a desperate, starving populace witnessing unspeakable acts. This became a literal, undeniable, and truly chilling truth. The white ship had cruelly claimed his flesh and blood, but perhaps a far darker, more insatiable hunger, born of the crown's ruthless demands and the kingdom's profound despair, truly began to gnaw at Henry's very soul, allowing the unspeakable whisper of cannibalism to become indelibly etched into the very fabric of his dark history, a testament to the depths of human despair and the lengths to which power can push even a king. Year after agonizing year, across the fertile lands of England and the hard-won territories of Normandy, the granaries emptied, the vital harvests failed, and the very earth seemed to turn against its desperate inhabitants. What little food remained became obscenely, prohibitively expensive, pushing commoners and even lesser nobles to the absolute brink of survival, forcing them to contemplate unspeakable acts. Villages lay silent, ravaged not only by the direct impact of hunger, but by the epidemics that inevitably followed their inhabitants, either dead or desperately seeking sustenance in the wild, scrounging for roots, bark, or anything to quiet their gnawing emptiness within. This wasn't merely a temporary scarcity, it was a profound, systemic collapse, an ecological, economic, and moral disaster that amplified the already immense political anxieties of Henry's precarious reign. The king himself still consumed by the unyielding grief for his lost son, and the relentless pressure of securing a male heir seemed to grow more distant. His once sharp, all-encompassing focus narrowed almost entirely to the survival of his dynasty even, as his subjects withered and died around him in droves. The crown, heavy with the weight of succession crisis and the ghosts of his lost future, became terrifyingly oblivious to the growing, existential desperation of his people. This widespread, agonizing suffering inadvertently created a fertile, nightmarish ground for the most grotesque and disturbing of rumors to take terrifying root. In such desperate times, when the very line between human civilization and primal savagery blurred with every passing, starving day, the truly unthinkable began to hover on the periphery of human imagination, ready to take hold. It was against this harrowing backdrop of widespread famine, escalating political instability, in the agonizing, desolate years that relentlessly followed the cataclysm of the White Ship disaster, King Henry I, once a figure defined by his calculating pragmatism and steely resolve, underwent a profound, disturbing metamorphosis. And so we finally arrive at the most disturbing, the most unsettling, and perhaps the most profoundly symbolic aspect of King Henry I's dark legend. The chilling whisper of a king who, in a moment of unimaginable desperation, devoured his own son, while the literal idea of cannibalism, of physically consuming William Adelin's body, lost forever to the depths of the Channel, remains firmly in the realm of grotesque rumor and historical sensationalism, and to his throne, with the desperate grip of a man haunted by a phantom future. Was it a monstrous act of literal cannibalism, born of a siege's desperation or a king's depravity? Or was it something far more profound, a tale twisted by the collective trauma of a starving populace, and the horrifying spectacle of a king consumed by his own grief? The historical record offers no definitive proof of the literal act, yet the legend, born of whispers in besieged castles and starving villages, persisted. It clung to Henry's legacy, a dark stain that centuries of historical revision could not fully erase. The story's true power lies not in its factual accuracy, but in its potent symbolism. It speaks to the profound psychological impact of the White Ship disaster on Henry, a wound so deep it transformed him. It speaks to the desperate, almost primal lengths to which a ruler, or any human, might be perceived to go in the face of ultimate, irreplaceable loss and the crushing demands of power. The king who ate his son became an enduring, horrifying legend, a testament to the chilling truth that when a man or a kingdom is consumed by an insatiable hunger for what is lost, the line between sanity and savagery, between history and nightmare, can blur into a terrifying, unforgettable tale. Henry I won his battles, held his kingdom, but in the end, he lost his son, and perhaps, in the minds of his people, his very humanity, leaving behind a whisper that still chills us to the bone. His relentless, tyrannical efforts to force his barons to accept Matilda, his daughter, as his heir had been met with simmering resentment and thinly veiled defiance. Then, in 1135, after a particularly heavy meal of his favorite, but notoriously rich. Lampreys, a type of ear-like fish, the inevitable finally came. Henry succumbed to a sudden, violent illness, collapsing and dying within days. But the irony was as bitter as his final breath. Despite a lifetime of ruthless calculation, of consolidating power, and of desperately trying to secure his dynasty through his daughter, his carefully constructed legacy shattered the moment his eyes closed forever. The kingdom he had held together with an iron fist, already strained by famine and the weight of his obsession, immediately plunged into a brutal, prolonged civil war, a period so devastating it became known simply as the Anarchy. Barons who had reluctantly sworn allegiance to Matilda now reneged on their oaths, backing Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew. England was torn asunder, a landscape of burning villages, besieged castles, and widespread misery. Henry's desperate actions, fueled by the loss of his son, had ultimately failed to prevent the very chaos he feared most. The crown, which had consumed his life, now seemed to consume his kingdom in a destructive fury, a final, tragic echo of his own internal void. Its tenacious persistence throughout the centuries reveals a far deeper, a far more chilling, and profoundly psychological truth. Henry's unyielding grief for William was not merely sorrow. It was an all-consuming, pathological hunger, a spiritual and emotional void that no amount of power or conquest could ever hope to fill. He had meticulously built his entire reign, painstakingly crafted his very identity, and staked his entire future upon the promise of stability and continuity embodied by William. When that promise tragically sank, without a trace, with the white ship, Henry was left with an unbearable, gnawing void that threatened to unravel his very sanity. He began, in a profound and terrifying metaphorical sense, to consume his son's vanished legacy, to devour his cherished memory, to internalize his very essence, in a desperate attempt to fill that gaping, unfillable void within his soul. His relentless, almost frenzied pursuit of a stable succession, his brutal, uncompromising suppression of any form of dissent, his obsessive efforts to bind his reluctant, resentful barons to the fragile claim of Matilda. These were not merely calculated acts of cold statecraft. They were, instead, the desperate, convulsive thrashings of a man trying to ingest, to internalize, to symbolically make whole again the future that had been so savagely, so irrevocably torn from him. The legendary act of cannibalism, therefore, becomes a potent, horrifying, and deeply resonant symbol. It speaks to a king so utterly devoured by his own crushing despair, by the insatiable tyrannical demands of the crown, and by the all-consuming hunger for a lost male heir, that this internal torment was powerfully projected onto him by a populace equally consumed by literal physical hunger and paralyzing fear. They witnessed his chilling ruthlessness, his profound detachment from their suffering, his relentless, almost inhuman drive amidst their own agonizing starvation, and in their terror. They manifested their collective dread in the most primal, the most taboo-breaking, and the most visceral image imaginable: the consumption of human flesh. This monstrous, enduring rumor of cannibalism thus became the dark, symbolic reflection of a king eaten alive by his own despair, by the relentless, unyielding demands of the crown. and by the phantom ache of what was brutally lost. The desperate whispers of his starving people, ironically, became a macabre mirror reflecting Henry's own profound internal starvation for a lineage secured, a future reclaimed. It was the ultimate psychological horror, a king who in his desperate, all-consuming craving for what had been taken from him became, in the chilling, distorted eyes of history, a devourer not of flesh, but of hope, of stability, of humanity, and ultimately of his very own tormented soul. This dark legend, more than any historical fact, paints the true portrait of a king utterly consumed. For nearly 2 decades after the White Ship disaster, King Henry I clung to life. So what are we to make of the chilling whisper that King Henry I, the Conqueror's son, devoured his own?